Like a giant foot that stomped on Tokyo, Gojira crushed his way onto the world on October 27th, 1954. When gearing the movie up for an international release, they changed the name to better reach an English-speaking audience. They took the words God, lizard, and gorilla and combined them to make Godzilla. When the film was released in the US as Godzilla King of the Monsters, it was re-edited, dubbed, and Americanized with new actors. The film was a massive hit for the studio Toho and is widely regarded as the first kaiju film, although Godzilla was itself inspired by the 1933 film King Kong, but that's a whole other video. While Gojira was the original name, Godzilla was the one that had the biggest impact globally. So moving forward, the monster was called Godzilla. Next in the franchise was 1955's Godzilla Raids Again, and then 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla. There were numerous movie studios in Japan, but none of them wanted to make their own monster film to compete with the king of all monsters. With the release of Rodan in 1956, Varan the Unbelievable in 1958, and the Godzilla spin-off Mothra in 1961, it looked like Toho had the kaiju market cornered. Meanwhile, in 1963, Daiei Studios was looking to dip a giant-sized toe into the kaiju pool. Although not in the way that you might think. In 1963, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds was released. The Birds was a dramatic horror film where something as common as birds have suddenly decided to turn on humans and attack. Daiei Studios wanted to make their own version, only with a different animal. They looked for ideas and saw a news story about an outbreak of rats on an island. The studio decided to make the movie, but replace the birds with rats. Although in addition to regular-sized rats, there would be giant 7-foot-long man-eating ones. The idea was to have these aggressive sewer rats become an even bigger menace after eating some experimental food, which was lifted from the 1904 novel The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells. They called it Nezura, the giant swarming beast, which eventually changed to Giant Horde Beast Nezura. The movie was set to be directed by Mitsu Murayama, who directed movies like The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly and Black Money. He was a director who frequently worked with Daiei Studios and had experience shooting films with visual effects. The studio initially wanted to use stop motion for the monsters. However, after some tests, they realized that stop motion was incredibly difficult and time-consuming, so they decided to go with actors in giant rat costumes and actual live rats. Initially, they used lab rats, but they proved to be too docile. They then switched to wild rats, which ended up being a huge mistake. The rats were, to put it lightly, difficult to work with. The rats avoided the lights because they were too hot, which made them hard to wrangle. They were constantly fighting with each other, and even though they were fed, they frequently resorted to cannibalism. The working conditions with the rats were awful. The rats pooped everywhere and infested the sets with fleas and ticks. Beyond that, the rats were biting the cast and crew, which made everyone miserable. It was not a sanitary or a safe set. The smarter rats were able to escape out of the stage and infested the local town. The locals were not too happy about this and reported the film to the health center. The health center came on set, and after seeing the horrible conditions, they shut down the film immediately and ordered the rats to be destroyed. They demanded they round up all the rats and cremate them by burning them with gasoline. The head of Daiei Studios said that burning the rats alive had more of a personal impact on him than anything else they had done for the production. He deeply regretted it, and the whole thing was depressing. He left the studio shortly thereafter. Before all this, the studio made a teaser trailer for the movie with the existing footage. However, after everything that happened, they did their best to suppress it and make sure it never saw the light of day. Now Daiei was in a bad spot. They just spent all this money on a film that they can never finish, which put them deeply in debt. It was supposed to be their big premiere monster movie that would have been released in late 1964, close to New Year's. The studio had all these sets and models they built for the movie, and they didn't want them to go to waste, but they had no idea what to do with them. That is, until Masaichi Nagata, the president of Daiei, had a vision. He was on a flight home to Japan from the US when he saw something that would change the course of direction for the studio. He looked out the window of the plane and saw either a cloud shaped like a turtle or an island that reminded him of a turtle. Either way, he thought about a giant turtle flying through the sky. At the next studio meeting, he stood up and said, "I want to make a movie about a flying turtle." He contacted their writer and idea man, Nissan Takahashi, and told him the basic idea of making a giant monster movie with a big turtle. Outside of Japan, the choice of giant turtle may seem weird. However, throughout Asia, turtles are considered symbols of good fortune, strength, wisdom, and longevity. Takahashi wrote a 4-page treatment in about 2 hours. The concept was about a giant flying turtle that ate fire called Fire-Eating Turtle Attacks Tokyo. The turtle needed a name, and so they called it Gamera. Kame was the Japanese word that meant turtle. Gamera sounded a little too much like camera, so they changed the name to Gamera. Although some at the studio didn't like it because the name started with G, ended with the suffix ra, and claimed it was too similar to Gojira. It even had the same amount of syllables. None of that mattered though. Nagata liked it so much, he ordered the treatment to be turned into a full screenplay. The studio was looking internally for a director, but none of them wanted the film. They said that such trash was beneath them, and doing it would only hurt their careers. Then they offered it to director Noriaki Yuasa. Yuasa was hired by Daiei in 1955, and he worked on a variety of films for them. It wasn't until 1964 when he directed his first film, the musical comedy, If You're Happy, Clap Your Hands. The movie was a box office failure, and Yuasa was given Gamera because none of the other directors at the studio wanted it. Yuasa saw this as his last chance to be a director. The film started with a small budget. However, after seeing that this was the first monster movie to attempt to rival Godzilla, made by a director whose last film was a flop, the studio's confidence in the production was low. As such, they cut the budget even further. The budget ended up being about 40 million yen, which was roughly about 188,000 in US dollars. Since the budget was incredibly low, the director was looking into ways to save money. A big one was the decision to shoot in black and white, which was much cheaper than shooting in color. As they were preparing to make the film, they had a major hurdle. There was no visual effects design team. Doing a visual effects heavy film was relatively foreign to them. They didn't even know where to buy piano wire, which they would need to hold up the jets and Gamera. Everything they did in the beginning was pretty much trial and error. As a way to combat this, they hired some ex-Toho employees who worked on the Godzilla films to do the effects work on Gamera. They crafted the suits, props, and everything else they needed for the production. They built a variety of different sized Gameras for the movie, about 25 total. This consisted of the full body suit, torsos for close-ups, and miniatures. For the cast, they brought in a wide variety of mostly seasoned Japanese actors. Although there were parts where they needed some Americans, so they hired a bunch of expats living in Japan. None of them were actors, and it showed. Although Yuasa figured that since they were filming them for a Japanese audience, no one would notice. They started filming in the fall of 1965. The film revolved around an incident where a plane is shot down over an island in Japan. Its nuclear payload detonates, which awakens Gamera. The mushroom cloud was a matte painting. Actually, there were more than a few matte paintings used in the film. As a way to give Gamera an origin, they showed that Gamera was from the lost city of Atlantis. They wanted to make it clear that he wasn't a prehistoric creature. Nuriyama wanted to add something to the film, a thematic undercurrent, the idea that Gamera was the protector of children. When Toshio, the kid who's obsessed with Gamera, almost dies at the lighthouse, Gamera saves him. This was interesting because he's still rampaging through Japan, killing who knows how many people, but at least this one kid lived. Gamera was made from a mold that consisted of latex mixed with sulfur and salt. Since the team working on this had previously worked on Godzilla, they were able to take the tricks they learned there and apply them here. As such, they were able to make a Gamera suit that was much lighter than the Godzilla suit. Although it was still about 110 pounds and stood about 6.5 feet tall. They hired some actors to wear the suit, but most couldn't handle it for more than 10 minutes at a time. They then hired some bodybuilders to wear the suit, but even they couldn't handle it. Every one of them quit after the first day. Without actors, the responsibility now fell to the crew, which was unfortunate. Each morning, the crew had to draw straws to see which one of them was going to have to be Gamera that day. At one point, one of the crew was wearing the suit and it was so heavy he couldn't move. When Gamera was flying, they had him hooked up to 3 pieces of piano wire. Although with his oblong shape, they needed to make one piece longer than the others so he rotated properly. They hooked him up to a motor overhead that spun him around. The rockets were tricky because they didn't always work. Many of the shots were ruined when a flare didn't light properly. There were also a few times where the flares burned through the wires and the Gamera prop crashed into the set. They did have some optical animation implemented for when Gamera is flying in the distance. As a way to make the film topical, they added in some references to flying saucers. Flying saucers were big news at the time, and with Gamera flying, they tied that into news reports of UFOs. They needed Gamera to be able to eat fire as well as spit fire, but they needed to do this in a way that was safe. For those scenes, they made the costume a little bit thicker if there was a person inside to protect them from the flames. Although most of the time when Gamera is spitting fire, it's either a half torso or a remote body. Every time they do a fire scene, they had to repair the mouth as it melted under the heat. The fire was from pressurized propane, which was very dangerous. Thankfully, there was only one incident, and no one was hurt. While filming a scene later in the film, the propane tank exploded. It took over a week to repair the suit, but again, thankfully, it was a remote model, and no one was inside. There was one other big mistake. That was in the scene where Gamera was destroying Tokyo Tower. Unfortunately, the suit was nowhere near it when it started to fall over. They couldn't afford to rebuild it, but they managed to save it with an insert and an edit. They shot an insert of Gamera pushing it, and with some clever editing, it looked like he knocked it over. For the buildings on fire, they took rags and soaked them in kerosene and metal powder, which gave off the black smoke. The smoke was highly toxic, so those scenes had to be shot outside. To show some of the destruction, they used insert shots of stock footage from natural disasters. The team put a lot of effort into Gamera's roar. It was a combination of animal sounds and human voices, all manipulated to deliver the sounds they needed for whatever scene. The shoot was very complicated due to some of the things they had to deal with. This included outdated equipment, broken props, and more. The biggest issue was some of the people at the studio were openly mocking the team working on the film. They'd come in while filming and say things like, "Is this what we're wasting our money on?" It was very frustrating for Yuasa because he genuinely believed in the production. It was time for a screening of a rough cut of the film, which stunned everyone. They were all impressed by how good the rough cut was. The reaction towards the film after seeing it in its current state was changed after that, and the studio employees were no longer mocking it and the director. Although the positivity around Gamera, they didn't want the monster to die in the end. So they came up with a way to defeat the beast without doing something like sending it back into the Earth. They lured it to a secret installation and launched it into space. September 16th to November 11th, they shot all the visual effects scenes. October 10th to November 9th, they shot all the live action sequences. In the end, largely because of the well-received rough edit, they were given a small amount of money beyond the initial budget to help them finish the film. Although there was next to no money for post, so they had a very short post period. Having to shoot the film in black and white ended up being beneficial to the film. With the lower budget, they had to cut some corners with the visual effects, and the black and white helped to hide some things that would have stuck out in color. Yuasa had a screening for the president of Daiei. After the screening was over, the director asked the president what he thought. He said, "That was really amusing." Not the response he was expecting, but the director was glad that he enjoyed it, and that was all that mattered. Gamera, the giant monster, hit theaters on November 27th, 1965, 16 days after filming ended. The movie shocked everyone when it went on to be very successful. This was the first non-Godzilla giant monster or kaiju film that was successful. When the film was going to play in the US, the American distributor, Harris, actually did something right. They took the scenes with the really terrible expats and cut them out. They then shot new scenes with American actors, which actually did improve the film for the American audience. They also recut the film to make Toshio less awful. They included some of the footage that was cut from the original Japanese production as well. The re-edited film ran about 4 minutes longer than the Japanese cut. They renamed the film to the misspelled Gamera the Invincible and released it into American theaters on December 15th, 1966. One of the new American characters was Dr. Contraire, played by Alan Oppenheimer. He later became an incredibly successful voice actor, with his best-known character being Skeletor from Masters of the Universe. The film was an international hit. Now that it was a success, Yuasa was vindicated. No one was calling it stupid or a waste of money anymore. In fact, Daiei wanted a sequel immediately. Their plan was to make a sequel where Gamera fights a race of aliens with ice powers who are trying to take over the Earth. The final battle would be Gamera versus an alien ice giant. Daiei decided instead to have Gamera fight something non-humanoid, a giant reptile. I wonder why he'd be fighting a giant reptile. They took sets and props that were already created, made some new ones, and wrote, shot, and released the next Gamera film in roughly 5 months. In the first film, Gamera was the villain, but in future entries, he becomes the hero. Gamera vs. Baragon hit theaters in Japan April 17th, 1966. This time, the film was in color. After the success of Gamera, this made other studios jump on the giant monster bandwagon, but none of them were nearly as successful. After that was Gamera vs. Gias, Gamera vs. Virus, Gamera vs. Guron, Gamera vs. Jiger, and Gamera vs. Zigra. With 7 films in 7 years, Gamera was beloved. The theme of Gamera, being the protector and friend of all children, was played up more in the sequels and really came through in Gamera vs. Guron. The studio then started working on the next Gamera film, Gamera vs. Wyvern, which would have Gamera go up against a 2-headed dragon. It's believed they decided to move away from the Wyvern since it was too close to King Ghidorah from Godzilla. Instead, they created Garasharp, a big snake with a wide array of weapons. This was planned for a 1972 release. Unfortunately, even with the success of Gamera, the studio still ended up having to declare bankruptcy in 1971. The studio, Takuma Shoten, worked with Daiei to make a new Gamera film 9 years after they declared bankruptcy. Gamera, Super Monster. This was the last Gamera film written by Nissan Takahashi and directed by Noriaki Yuasa. The movie was made extremely cheap as a last-ditch effort to get the studio out of bankruptcy. The movie was mostly footage from previous Gamera films, with some new footage to try to give it a cohesive story. It hit theaters in Japan on March 20th, 1980, on a double bill with the Astro Boy episode Earth Defense Army. Unfortunately, it didn't do well at all, and Daiei was absorbed into Takuma Shoten and continued on as a subsidiary. They relied on other studios to help distribute their films, and one of them, oddly enough, was Toho. For the next few years after this, the films they released were mostly period dramas like The Silk Road and Dreams of Russia. 1965 to 1980 was called the Showa era, which referred to the reign of the Showa Emperor Hirohito. It looked like this might be the last we see of Gamera. Then, something unexpected happened. Producer Sandy Frank, with his company, Sandy Frank Entertainment, acquired the U.S. distribution rights to the Gamera movies, along with other Japanese productions like Battle of the Planets and Fugitive Alien. Frank redubbed and further Americanized the films, changing many of the characters' names. For example, the biggest one that most will remember is that Toshio is now the infamous Kenny. He shortened the films so they would run as Movie of the Week films on UHF. The Sandy Frank versions of the films hit TV and home video in the US in 1985. The quality of the dubs was considered not good, which is something that Frank became notorious for. Because of the bad American dubs mixed with the re-edits of the films, this made the movies appear to new viewers as cheap Godzilla knockoffs. Keep in mind, most of the target audience probably wasn't alive when the last full Gamera film was released. A few years later, December 4th, 1988, a little show on KTMA Minneapolis, Minnesota ran a series called Mystery Science Theater 3000. Episode 4 was Gamera vs. Baragon. They had the American dubbed recut Sandy Frank version, which they ruthlessly mocked. Mystery Science Theater was a breakout hit, and the show left KTMA for the cable channel, the Comedy Channel. The Comedy Channel was merged with Ha! TV Comedy Network and became Comedy Central. June 8, 1991, Episode 2 of Season 3 on Comedy Central ran the American edit of the original Gamera. After that, they ran Gamera vs. Baragon, Gamera vs. Gaius, Gamera vs. Gurion, and Gamera vs. Zigra, all the Sandy Frank versions. This introduced an entirely new generation to Gamera, although it wasn't until the episode for Time of the Apes where they did the Sandy Frank song.
Sandy Frank, he's the source of all our pain.
Even though they mocked the films on the show, they made more people check them out and created tons of new fans of the Flying Turtle, myself included. I'm not saying that Mystery Science Theater was entirely responsible for the return of Gamera, but it definitely helped. Daiei was looking to resurrect their Daijimin series, but due to the current resurgence in Gamera's popularity, they decided to revive him instead. Gamera then returned to Japan in 1995 with Guardian of the Universe. This was the beginning of the Heisei era, which spawned 4 films. Around this time, we got the first Gamera video game, Gamera the Time Adventure, in 1995. Since then, there were a total of 12 Gamera games, most of which being exclusive to Japan. I have Gamera 2000, which is more or less a rail shooter. In 2023, Netflix released Gamera Rebirth, an animated Gamera series that looked excellent, but considering there hasn't been any news since it came out, I don't know if it's coming back. In 2022, there was the giant monster fighting game Gigabash. They just released Gamera DLC in November of 2025. This gives the ability to play the Rebirth versions of Gamera and Gurion. After several successful crowdfunding campaigns, Mystery Science Theater was able to return to the Gamera series with Gamera vs. Jiger, July 22, 2022. This was episode 7 of season 13. As of currently, that was the last Gamera film they covered, and right now, since their last crowdfunding didn't go so well, there may not be any more episodes. Aside from Gamera vs. the Space Icemen, there were other Gamera films that never came to fruition. Gamera vs. Phoenix, which was supposed to be a revival of the franchise for its 30th anniversary. The movie wasn't made, but the screenplay was released as a novel. In 2002, the studio, Kadokawa Shoten, acquired Daiei's catalog. They then renamed the company to Kadokawa Daiei Motion Picture Company. Later in 2002, Kadokawa reached out to Toho to make Godzilla vs. Gamera. Toho turned down the offer. With Kadokawa being the new owners, they wanted to make a new Gamera film for its 40th anniversary. In 2006, they released Gamera the Brave. This was a reboot of the franchise that incorporated elements from all the previous entries. For Gamera's 50th anniversary in 2015, Kadokawa released a 4-minute Gamera short made with CG. This was the last Gamera media made during the Heisei era. In 2020, there was the concept for Gamera 3D, which would have been a 40-minute movie made specifically for IMAX. In 2020, there was the docudrama Nezura, 1964, where they tried to recreate the hectic filming conditions of the failed film. Gamera has returned time and time again, whether it be movies, comics, manga, novels, video games, and of course, toys. Lots of toys. It's now the 60th anniversary of Gamera. Kadokawa launched the Gamera Expo for the Gamera 60th Anniversary Project. There's tons of pictures for the live event, and lots of Gamera-related material from his past, as well as projections for his future. Gamera has come a long way in 60 years. From a movie that was laughed at by its own studio, to a franchise that has outlasted many, many others, and is beloved by millions. Yuasa loved Gamera, and directed 6 of the 7 films in the Showa era. Sadly, he died in 2004 and isn't around to see how beloved Gamera is today. He's the giant turtle that is indeed invincible. Just be on the lookout for Kenny.
Sandy Frank, Sandy Frank.
Films are poorly done.
Sandy Frank, Sandy Frank. Spielberg will return his calls.